Would you like to know how to overcome depression and anxiety using cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT as it's known in the field? Well, then watch this video to find out. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, to this day is still considered the gold standard treatment in the psychotherapy domain anyway, for depression and anxiety. So let's talk about why that exactly is. Watch this video to find out. Hello, my name is Jesse. Welcome to my channel, Open Source Owners, where we talk about what if humans had an owner's manual. If you were to take mental health together and look at it as a whole, you could describe it as a global epidemic, and these numbers sort of highlight why. Depression, #1 cause of disability and injury. 350 million people affected with depression every year. Anxiety, #1 mental health disorder, diagnosed in the United States of America with about 1 in 5. And worldwide, the staggering number is 1 billion individuals will be affected negatively by mental health disorder diagnoses. 750 million people will never receive treatment for their mental health struggles. Okay, so what is CBT? Cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's got two parts, right? The cognitive part and the behavioral part. And if you go back in history, the behavioral part came first. So what used to just be called behavioral therapy came out in the early 1900s. And behavioral therapy was one of the off branches of psychotherapy, as exemplified by Freud and his cohorts at the time. In the 1960s, however, science had reached a place where we could look into the brain and we could start to understand brain mapping. And that's when the so-called cognitive revolution really began. And that affected pretty much every domain, especially in the social sciences, but it definitely affected psychology and psychiatry. By the early 1970s, cognitive behavioral therapy developed. So behavioral therapy, as you may sort of have guessed, is going to have to do with like how behaviors impact thoughts and mood. And then cognition was brought into that picture. So not only how behaviors do, but how thinking affects mood and behavior and thought. So it becomes this whole cycle of how all these things interact with one another. And by the 1990s, CBT had become really the gold standard psychotherapy for depression and anxiety. I found this article from 2018, which basically is a summary of CBT and why it's still, as the authors argue, considered the gold standard for depression and anxiety. The biggest reason is because it's been the most studied and it has the most efficacious outcomes. So it has the highest sort of ratings in outcome studies in the psychotherapy fields. So as we talked about, CBT, what is it? Well, it involves thoughts, it involves behaviors, it involves emotions. Remember, it's about cognition, so that's the thoughts, and that says what we think affects how we feel and how we act. It's about behaviors, that's what we do. What we do affects how we think and feel. It's about emotions because what we feel affects how we think and how we act. Most of CBT is really, you'll notice, based on changing thinking to both influence our behaviors and change how we feel about life events. The reason CBT is the gold standard, the reason cognition is so critical, is because we now recognize that if we have 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day, the types of thoughts, the emotional content of those thoughts, the effect of those thoughts on our behaviors actually becomes really critical when we're talking about such a large number, such a large amount of volume of thinking that goes on in the brain. And as we've talked about before, most of those thoughts are subconscious, so programming thoughts, past thoughts that used to work for us and may or may not still work for us in the future, may or may not still work for us in the present. So it stands to reason that if we can begin to gain some sort of awareness and control over the types of thoughts that we have, that those will cascade down and begin to change behaviors and begin to change how we feel about day-to-day interactions with other people and with ourselves. First of all, on the right-hand side this is the book that largely popularized CBT in the general zeitgeist, and that's Feeling Good by David Burns. There's been an update to that, and I'll actually show you in the sort of latest iteration of CBT toward the end of this video, but that's still a really good book. It still has a ton of the basically foundational understandings of CBT. It's really a book that's designed to be something that a client or a patient or just a human can use on their own without the need of a therapist necessarily. CBT therapy differs from other therapies, especially psychotherapies, in the sense that a really good trained CBT therapist will sort of teach you these basic skills and give you these basic sort of platforms to work with in terms of navigating the cognitive, behavioral, emotional triangle. And then after some period of time, not that long, after you've done 6 to, let's say, 12 sessions with the CBT trained therapist, it's very likely that they'll say, okay, You don't need me for a little while. Go out and just live your life and see how these things are working for you or not. And when you really start to notice your mood begins to dip again, come back and we'll sort of retrain you up. We'll give you the next level of skills, etc. So it's not the type of therapy where you're just going to come and talk to your therapist and say, well, what happened in your childhood and how was your relationship, and just talk to me about your day, that type of thing. This type of therapy is much more skills based. Often you'll be getting some type of homework or some type of things to practice over week 1 or week 2 or week 3. If you're more inclined personally to have a type of therapy that's like skill based, then CBT would be a great fit for you. All right, let's look at some of the cognitive distortions. So this is just one aspect of CBT, but it's probably the most well known, which is they came up with a list of cognitive distortion, or as one of my clients called it, stinkin' thinking. So this is the ways that many humans, including your therapist and wonderful people, it's not just co-signed to the group of people that have, quote, mental illness. Most of us have cognitive distortions of all types, and these are just some common ones. And there's a bunch more. If you've ever looked at the Codex of Cognitive Biases, you'll see that there's just hundreds, literally hundreds of sort of cognitive filtering mechanisms that allow the brain to perform an easier task of things, but may actually misrepresent reality or misrepresent experiences to us. So it's useful to be aware of these, and it's particularly useful in the context of dealing with depression and anxiety to determine for ourselves the primary cognitive distortions that we fall into regularly, so that we can keep an eye on them, we can label them, and then we can do replacement type thoughts, which is, of course, CBT's bread and butter, is recognizing the type of cognitive distortion and then providing you alternative ways to think and alternative things to say to yourself and alternative ways to relate to your emotions and alternative behaviors to engage in. Okay, number 1, all or nothing thinking. You look at things in absolute and black and white categories. So that's something that many people can relate to, of course, and it's also something that our culture tends to do, with sort of like dividing people into this camp and that camp. So all or nothing thinking is considered a distortion because, of course, most things in life are sort of gray, some gradation of this or that, not just clearly black or clearly white, clearly good or clearly bad, clearly acceptable or clearly unacceptable. Many things have gradations, and it's much better to navigate the world recognizing all these different gradations of things than it is to have all or nothing thinking. Number 2 is overgeneralization. So you view a negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. You could do that with a relationship. Every time I get in a relationship, it ends in a breakup, and it's really an ugly breakup. So therefore, all my relationships are doomed. You know, you could do it in school, like, hey, I failed that test. I suck at math, or I will forever be bad at X, Y, or Z. These are overgeneralizations, taking some data from the real world, that negative event, but then extrapolating that out into the future as if your future is determined. And we're not going to go through all of these. You can read through some of these. I'm going to go to discounting the positives, number 4. You insist that your accomplishments or positive qualities don't count. Maybe I do this YouTube video and I get 5 really nice comments and then 1 comment that's sort of rude. Discounting the positive is the ability of the mind and the tendency of the mind to focus on the negative comment and sort of dismiss all the other positive comments. So if we're weighing things out, we're going to be weighing the negative much more than the positive. I've had friends like this where you say like, oh, I think you're really talented at X, Y, or Z, and that's one of the things I really love about you. And they'll be like, oh, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And you might do that with somebody's looks. Oh, you're so beautiful. Oh, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And people who genuinely can't accept compliments, this is a real issue in terms of how it affects their mood and how it affects their behavior. How that thinking pattern, that sort of false belief that their negatives outweigh their positives, affects the whole triangle of the CBT sort of thought, emotion, behavior triangle. Read all these on your own because these are all very useful to just understand. And in my humble opinion, I think these should be taught in elementary school and middle school to everybody. Everybody should be aware of these and fluent in understanding cognitive distortions. They're just that ubiquitous. We should just have a world where these are well understood. But let's go now to number 7, emotional reasoning. So you reason from how you feel. So like, I feel like an idiot, so I must be one. This is very common in depression and anxiety, but particularly depression. Like, I feel really low energy, therefore I'm not going to sort of like take a walk, or I'm not going to go out and get sun, or I'm not going to drink water, or I'm not going to eat good food, right? So that depressive sort of feeling actually feeds back into our behavior, and it feeds back into how we believe that reality is. So we don't challenge it necessarily, and therefore we become it. And let's go to labeling, number 9. Instead of saying, I made a mistake, you tell yourself, I'm a jerk, or I'm a fool, or I'm a loser. Well, you're not a jerk or a loser. You may have done a thing that was like a jerky thing to do, or you may have lost or failed at something you were trying to accomplish, but it doesn't make you fundamentally a loser or a jerk or unlovable or something like that. Now, as a reminder, a lot of negative type of thoughts, especially self-perception, like thinking that you're not lovable, you're not good enough, you're not worthy just to be a human, those don't come from your own brain. That's not because of a mental illness. That's usually and typically from early attachment wounding, trauma, emotional neglect, that type of thing. Having a parent who may have been a narcissist or struggling with borderline or schizophrenic, and they're sort of projecting their confusion of the world or their narcissism onto you as a child, unfairly, I might add, and making you believe then as a child, because you really have no other framework to understand these types of things. So the child internalizes what's going on with a disruptive or an emotionally cold or an emotionally abusive parent. We internalize it because we can't understand that it's actually, oh, mom has a mental illness. We're too young. We don't get that yet. We can get it later. But unfortunately, that's a little bit too late because of the programming, the internalization of I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy has already been installed, unfortunately. Now, the resolution to that type of thing is working in good therapy, CBT being one of them, and really started to reparent ourselves, reskill ourselves with the skills, the knowledge that we couldn't have known as children, and installing those programs now into our adult consciousness. It's totally doable. You can rewrite your attachment style. You can rewrite your trauma history in the sense that you could be diagnosable with PTSD, and then you could do some really good trauma therapy. And then at the end of that therapy, you would no longer be diagnosable with PTSD. So it's very possible. So don't give up hope, but it does take work because that programming often was laid down way before we had conscious choice. Remember, I talk about all the time, ages 0 to 7 is the critical programmable channel and the programmable time of being a child. So what happens from 0 to 7 really affects how we then view ourselves later in life. And that's really the origin of self-hatred, low levels of self-esteem, low levels of self-worth. The latest iteration of CBT is pretty interesting. It's called TEAM, T-E-A-M, and TEAM is an acronym. Those letters stand for testing, empathy, agenda setting, and methods. So TEAM, testing, empathy, agenda setting, and methods. And this new model has come out of David Burns' work, who wrote Feeling Good. Now he has a new book called Feeling Great. But particularly this new team model is having really good success with depression and anxiety. And you can work with a team specialist. If you go to this website here, this is feelinggoodinstitute.com, and you look right up here, it says find a therapist. You can find a therapist by state, by directory, by city, etc. So this would be my number one recommendation for your next, if you've never done CBT, try Team CBT first because it's got 30, 40 years of data behind it to sort of take it to that next level. But also Team CBT can be done from the comfort of your own home. With this directory, you can find somebody who works in your state, takes your insurance, etc. Now, if you don't have insurance, if you're one of those 750 million people worldwide who do not receive or cannot receive treatment for their mental illness, then buy the book or watch this channel more or listen to David Burns' podcast. So there's a lot of free information that you can engage with, and actually the really sort of hardworking, astute individual can do this sort of stuff on their own. You don't necessarily need a therapist. Therapists like mentors or coaches can be so invaluable because they can sort of like help you move along whenever you get stuck. And it's really easy to get stuck doing our own mental health sort of work. So therapists, mentors, coaches, that's the frame where I think we can really accelerate our healing and our own mental health wellness. But again, if you can't afford the therapist, try to find something that's available for free, for cheaper. In this day and age with podcasts, YouTube videos, there's a ton of stuff for free. And books are such a great thing. Feeling Good, Feeling Great, either of those two books would be worth the $10 that you paid to get them. Lots of information, lots of like, try this for a week, try this for a month. Here's a mood log, try that. So lots of practical skills that you can get out of these books with or without a therapist, with or without support. If you do want a little bit of mentorship, this is my program, the Home Subscription Model, where we go through month by month the 4 different domains of what it means to actually have sustainable mental health. Now, CBT would fit in the psychological domain. That's clearly in the psychological domain. It's fantastic. It's one of the great, again, that's why they call it the gold standard. It's one of the great therapies in the psychological domain. But for true sustainable mental wellness, you need all 4 of those domains working in conjunction together. If we think of it like a bucket, you need to make sure that there's no big leaks, big issues, big foundational issues in any of those 4 domains in order to expect to have sustainable mental health, which is totally your birthright. It's totally possible. Now, a little bit of mentorship goes a long way. So partner with me if you're interested in this, and you can just click the link below to check out more about the home program. Hey guys, thanks so much for making it all the way to the end. That was overcoming depression and anxiety using CBT. And if you never knew about CBT, well, now you know a little bit about it. If you already knew about CBT, hopefully you'll learn something new about Team CBT. And if you've had CBT or if you do Team CBT, I want to know what your experience has been like. Go ahead and put a comment below. We'd all love to read that. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate you. Take care of yourselves out there, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.